we have a big turnout today. How important is it, the street movement, demonstrations in this movement to help Assange?
It's crucial because I think in the judicial system as it operates here, knowing that what is happening outside does have an impact. And so I think it's important to demonstrate that there are people who care that the truth is being told.
Well, all movements do have to have a street movement to come along with it. Are you impressed by today's turnout?
Well, I hope there'd be 4 times as many people. But given the campaign of slander and innuendos against Julian, they have succeeded quite effectively to a certain extent in making him an unperson and someone, maybe he's okay, maybe he's right, but he's not a pleasant person, mixing up a lot of rubbish which now is proved. More and more stuff is coming out on how the entrapment of Julian took place.
Right. Nils Melzer came out with that analysis of the entire. All right, thanks a lot. As I said, Tariq Ali does not need an introduction. If you don't know who Tariq Ali is, you're from a different planet. But I will tell you that he is he's a political activist, he's a writer, he's a journalist, he's a historian, he's a filmmaker, and he's published a number of works, including the 2 that I have with me today, which he's the editor of Assange, in Defense of Julian Assange, that he co-edited with my closest friend, Margaret Ratner Kunstler, and also this brilliant book called The Dilemmas of Lenin. You've got to read this book. You can get it at Verso. Man, I read it this week, again, the second time this week. And, of course, I've read the Julian Assange in Defense of when I was in London, where I got a chance. I've been wanting you on this show now for 4 years, Tariq.
Oh, well, that's nice to hear.
I really have, and I didn't know how to go about it because I know you're a busy man. You got these interviews with Oliver Stone. You're writing books. You're busy at all times. And I finally said, Margaret, can I get him on? So I went to London and I met you outside the rally where you gave this rousing speech in front of a throng of about 1,000 people, and I asked you then. And it was a real pleasure. What a speech that was, by the way, down there. And afterwards we spoke, Tariq. And right now we're going to talk about Julian Assange because I asked you back then, I thought it was a big turnout, and you said it wasn't big enough. So can you elaborate on that?
Well, it was a biggish turnout in the sense that there's been such a campaign of innuendo and slanders against Julian that I was happy there were about 1,000+ people there. But ideally, I was hoping for 10,000, and if not more, because this is such a serious case of civil rights violations, freedom of the press, the right to publish, that more people should have come, and they'll feel bad. Quite a few people who didn't come emailed apologizing, but nonetheless, it was good we did it. It was good we did it in public. It was good we did it outside the Houses of Parliament. And this infamous trial of Julian is taking place. It will carry on. The first phase is over. It will go all the way up to the British, UK Supreme Court, and we'll see what happens. But I certainly was hoping for more people, Randy, at that demonstration, because there should be an awareness that it's not just Julian Assange. He's basically fighting for all those who believe in freedom of speech and freedom to write, freedom to think.
Well, it's very important to have a ground game here. I mean, this, you take a political prisoner like Nelson Mandela, where tens of thousands of people would show up all the time. In the case of Julian Assange, it's not happening at this point in time because of the smear campaign against him, basically, right?
Right, absolutely. And I would sort of go further and say that the newspapers that utilized WikiLeaks to increase their circulations. Liberal newspapers like the New York Times in the States, The Guardian here, should have campaigned vigorously and effectively, demanding that these absurd charges be dropped. They didn't. They've come out against the attempt to extradite him to the United States, to be fair. But this should have been a consistent campaign, and the Guardian reporting of the trial was, I thought, rather weak. I mean, the person writing it was good, but the publicity given to it and the place in the newspaper was weak. But then I read today, Randy, that some more enlightened judge in the United States has released Chelsea Manning from prison, where she had been locked up for refusing to testify to a grand jury and provide evidence for prosecuting Assange. Credit to her. I'm really pleased that she's out. And a British equivalent of the judge who released Chelsea would immediately release Julian Assange today, because there's no case to answer.
Well, I don't know if I was there for that trial. I watched 3 days of it, totally amazed.
Appalling.
It was the worst thing. I want to play something for you by Margaret Kunstler's late husband, William Kunstler, and tell me if this pretty much describes the scene at that courtroom of what's going on. Let me just play this 1 minute clip here, okay?
The terrible myth of organized society, that everything that's done through the established system is legal, and that word has a powerful psychological impact. It makes people believe that there is an order to life and an order to a system, and that a person that goes through this order and is convicted has gotten all that is due him, and therefore society can turn its conscience off and look to other things and other times. And that's the terrible thing about these past trials, is that they have this aura of legitimacy, this aura of legality. I suspect that better men than the world has known, and more of them, have gone to their death through a legal system than through all the illegalities in the history of man. 6 million people in Europe during the Third Reich, legal. Sacco Vanzetti, quite legal. The Haymarket defendants, legal. The hundreds of rape trials throughout the South, where black men were condemned to death, all legal. Jesus, legal. Socrates, legal. And that is the kaleidoscopic nature of what we live through here and in other places. Because all tyrants learn that it is far better to do this thing through some semblance of legality than to do it without that pretense.
Your thoughts on that statement by Bill Kunstler right after the Chicago 8 trial?
Brilliant. I mean, he was a very special person. And, people like him, well, they still exist, but not on that level and not of that quality, in my opinion. I mean, Julian has got some very brilliant lawyers. Gareth Pierce, for instance, who's the solicitor on the case, is excellent. But the Kunstler's equivalent doesn't exist in the United States. And in Britain, the legal system is different, but, neither here. So it's very good you read that out. That was on the Chicago trial,
yes.
Another monstrosity.
Right after the Chicago 7 trial. I got to know him very well. I met him in '86. I basically moved into the house, and he was quite the figure. He really was. I went with him on his book tour in 1995. He died later that year. But what he says there about these the semblance of legality, these trials. Is this a classic show trial in the 36, 37 Russian trials by Stalin?
But those were legal too, unfortunately.
Yeah, right.
And they forced, in those trials, in the Moscow trials, of course, they forced people to confess, and that ended the trial. I mean, if you confess you're guilty, that's it. And that they didn't succeed in doing in some of the trials that Kunstler was mentioning, and that they haven't done in Julian's trial. It's so obvious. It's a fake, rigged trial being pushed through. He should have been released the minute his arrest for jumping bail was over. And they kept keeping him in extremely bad conditions. I mean, the night before the trial opened, Randy, they changed his cell 5 times in the night to disorient him. I mean, where does this happen? This is meant to be a country where legal norms are observed, and this, incredibly biased judge or senior magistrate, or call her what you will, refused to give an instruction to the prison governor on a number of issues, which other judges have done with some effect. Yeah. So there's no doubt whatsoever, it's a very vindictive process that is taking place in Britain.
I was really amazed by that judge not granting or just giving an edict. You got to treat this guy. If he's going to be in my courtroom, you can't treat him like this.
I know.
I look at him, Tariq. I look at him. He's been in Belmarsh almost a year. He has been in that embassy for 10 years. And I'm looking at past cases like that, the resilience that he has, the resourcefulness that he has. I look back at when Kropotkin was in the Peter and Paul Fortress. I read his autobiography. He was there for a couple of years before his escape, but he would walk in circles inside that very small prison cell. And you had others in the Santo Stefano prison under King Francis in Sicily or in Naples. So you have some people who are able to survive it and then go on and continue to work. What is it that makes Julian so special?
Well, what makes Julian so special that his case is taking place in a period where the mass media has become a central pillar for defending wars and neoliberalism, which is a shift from the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the early 80s. And in this world, they don't want people like Assange to exist and do what they're doing. So effectively, it's a very open and crude preventive measure. This is how we're going to treat you, and if there are any people tempted by whistleblowing or publishing material handed over by whistleblowers are thinking of doing it, just watch what we're going to do to Julian Assange. That is the purpose of this trial. There is no other purpose.
In the book, In Defense of Assange, in the very first paragraph, you quote Ingalls, and that this certain moment in time, these two parallelograms or whatever that are floating around, the evil and the good, and how they clash at some point, and then you go into talking about how Assange finally emerges, the birth of WikiLeaks after 9/11 and the lies and nobody knowing the truth, and then with all these different elements, the birth of WikiLeaks. Can you go into that?
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, you've summed it up, Randy. It's very good that Margaret and I did this book, In Defense of Julian Assange, which is published by OR or Books in New York.
Orbooks.com.
Orbooks, yes. And it was Colin Robinson's idea, the publisher, and it was a very good idea because there's been too much silence about Julian. So we managed to do it. Large numbers of people known and not so well known, participated in and contributed to the book, and it's been doing extremely well. All proceeds go to the Courage Foundation.
Right. Yeah.
Which is set up to fight the case. So I would urge people to read it. It's not just the introduction that I wrote with Margaret. It's a book complete with arguments to use against people who are inactive or misinformed. And the UN reporter on torture,
Niels
Melzer.
Yes.
Niels Melzer gave an amazing speech at the, at one of the big meetings we held in London, where he said how he himself had been misled by the unending sewage of slander and rumors that were being spread to discredit Julian Assange. And then when he investigated, he realized that how all this was part of an entrapment scheme that had been put in place. I don't think he named any country, but it's obviously the CIA and intelligence services elsewhere. So that sort of material is in the book. And the aim of the book is very simple, to educate people on the Assange affair and say, please do not forget this guy or what is being done to him for bringing to you information which enabled you to see the brutality and savagery of the imperial wars that the United States has been waging in the Arab world. I mean, I have to say here, Randy, that even Trump, monster though he is, does occasionally admit that when he wants the wars to end, or he says he does, it's not just to save American lives, but he mentions in his last tweet on the subject the millions of Arab people that we have killed. Most U.S. presidents rarely talk about the damage they've caused. This guy, I don't know why, but he does it. And it confirms what we know, that over 1 million people were killed in Iraq as a result of constant U.S. intervention, sanctions, and bombings, and finally the occupation. And what Julian did, thanks to the information made available by Chelsea Manning, was to put all this material out so it could be seen by the press. And one of the things that hurt the United States propagandists the most was a video showing a helicopter just killing people at leisure, just as a game, and the sort of thick conversation that the pilots had with each other. I mean, that was incredibly revealing, actually.
Well, prior to that, and you describe the mainstream media, The Guardian and others, before this, in respects to the war, that they were basically getting State Department handouts. We didn't know what the hell was going on. And you quote Wellington saying, "Publish and be damned. Publish and be damned." And WikiLeaks did just that. Can you go into that?
Well, yeah. I mean, the way they cover wars now has changed a lot since the Vietnam War. After the Vietnam War, they decided, the powers that be, that the relative freedom afforded to television and print media journalists to cover that war couldn't be risked again, because they think it's the media coverage that created the huge anti-war movement. Now, this is only partially true. It's true that the coverage of the Vietnam War on CBC and CBS every night did play a part, but you had Senate hearings going on, which were shown on television too, with Senator Fulbright questioning the very nature of the war and having government people there in front of him. But most importantly is that the U.S. was then enforcing conscription, so that every single U.S. family was affected I was going to say despite class, color, or creed, but obviously very rich whites got off, like George Bush. They could avoid conscription. And then there was a political campaign not to fight in the Vietnam War, so many people fled the States and went to Canada or came to Europe or went to Mexico to avoid fighting in this brutal imperial war. So that all created the atmosphere, but the media did report all this. Now, the attempt during the Middle Eastern wars after 9/11 was to keep the media under very strict control and ensure that what journalists were writing was, if not vetted, certainly corrected and miscorrected and lied about whenever there was any critical reporting. So that made critical reporting of the wars virtually impossible, and there were then embedded journalists who went in with the armies, the United States and other NATO armies fighting these wars, and were allowed access only to what the army wanted them to see, because the situation was very dangerous. I think Robert Fisk of The Independent was one of the few journalists who then broke through by visiting unauthorized sites and telling us what was going on. But the big breakthrough came when Chelsea Manning, horrified by what she was witnessing and reading, decided to make the reports public. And that is when WikiLeaks came into its own and began to publish, and then they published a lot of other material, all very useful material which wasn't in the public domain. So they played an amazing role. And in that sense, Randy, it should be understood that WikiLeaks has done what couldn't be done by individual whistleblowers in the past. So Julian wasn't saying, hi, I'm getting this info from X, I'm Julian Assange, I'm releasing it. It was an organization that did it. And it was this organizational brilliance of WikiLeaks, inspired by Julian and others, which enabled the material to go all over the world. That they want to finish, but I think it's not going to be easy to do that.
As you say, WikiLeaks has been exposing all the lies, has shined a light on all of the lies that have, brought us into these wars. In this country, we've had a long tradition of suppressing journalism, or they've been totally co-opted. You go way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts here, where you had people like Matthew Lyon and Jedediah Peck who opposed the Alien and Sedition Act. They were prosecuted for that. So it's really important that the press is really important to inform people. And you go to the French, because you talk about, and we're going to talk about your book in just a minute, the other book about the French Revolution, and with people like Marat and Des Moines and Brissot and others, they were under attack in the very beginning. They were, in fact, Marat was like hunted down by Lafayette. They didn't want him to tell the truth of what was going on in France. Am I right?
Absolutely right. The French Revolution erupted after at least a decade of publicity, books, pamphlets, newspapers pointing out how horrific the situation was, and many of these people were imprisoned or had to flee into exile. But that created the atmosphere and the milieu in which the revolutionaries flourished in the late 18th century, when the revolution erupted in 1789. So, yeah, our journalism was new, but it played a very big part in it. And the spread of information was both by pamphlets, cartoons, newspapers, weeklies, and also by word of mouth, where people couldn't read, or in areas where there was illiteracy, people would gather and someone would read a newspaper to them in lamplight, candlelight. There was a very strong tradition of that. And, of course, later in Tsarist Russia, where underground magazines were constantly being repressed, changing their names, etc., etc. So there is a long tradition of this, but we've now reached a new level with the advance of technology, which helps both sides. I mean, it helps the National Security Agency in the United States to monitor and carry out surveillance on whoever they want, including the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, whoever. No problems at all. So ordinary activists can be their accounts, their smartphone calls, everything's monitored.
Yes.
So when people act like Chelsea Manning did, through very clever IT networks, in this case WikiLeaks, then immediately they toughen up the measures to see how they can catch them. But it is not possible in today's world to predict everything. So often, as in the past, stuff gets through. Right. And it has always been the case. It was ever thus. In different ways, different forms of technology, different forms of spying, to prevent the people from learning the truth. That is the key.
We're talking to Tariq Ali. Tariq, I want to ask you, when was the last time Fidel from Ecuador, Narvaez, told me that he thinks you were there in 2018 or 2017 or 2018, the last time you saw Julian Assange?
The last time I saw Julian was a few weeks before he was taken to prison, before the new government in Ecuador decided to dump him, having made available the embassy to very high-grade Spanish surveillance done by a Spanish security firm on the instructions of the U.S. intelligence agencies. So I saw Julian at the embassy. He was on that day in good spirits. I'd gone with Colin Robinson to discuss the book with him, and he was very much in favor of the book. And at that time, we were all hoping that Jeremy Corbyn might be elected, and that would have sorted out this case, because there's no doubt a Labour government would have dropped the charges. But anyway, that was not to happen. But so Julian was in a relatively good mood, but without any illusions as to what the judicial system he was confronting in Britain was likely to do. And at that time, he was, despite his 10 years in the embassy, he was looking good. I told him that, and he said, I've been doing a lot of working out, because I said, you're looking much healthier than the last time I saw you, which was about over a year ago. And he said, yeah, I am feeling better too. All that came to an end when he was taken to prison, where they were determined to break him.
I'm sure there's video of you talking to him by UC Global, Tariq. You just mentioned Corbyn. I want to play this quick clip of Corbyn and ask you what the implications of this, or the import of this exchange with Boris Johnson. Can you play that, Frank?
This deep disparity with the US is about to be laid bare when the courts decide whether the WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange will be extradited to the US on charges of espionage for exposing war crimes, the murder of civilians, and large-scale corruption. Will the Prime Minister agree with the parliamentary report that's going to the Council of Europe that this extradition should be opposed and the rights of journalists and whistleblowers upheld for the good of all of us? Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on any individual case, but it is obvious that the rights of journalists and whistleblowers should be upheld, and this government will clearly continue to do that.
Well, what do you make of that exchange, which I know you've
Well,
already
I
seen?
thought, Jeremy was obviously very good, but I thought that Boris Johnson's reply was not a reply that I was expecting. He did not defend the trial, we noticed. So it did make, I discussed this with Jeremy subsequently, this particular issue. And we did both wonder whether there was some divisions within the judicial establishment on this, which Boris Johnson was reflecting. But it was not a fanatical response at all. It was calm. So fingers crossed, but I mean, one shouldn't take it too seriously.
Well,
but I notice, Randy, that very few U.S. lawmakers are raising the issue of Assange, which is a big, big mistake. I mean, I do think that Bernie Sanders, the most left-wing candidate in the Democratic race, should have raised the issue of Assange, and these new, young, very inspiring female lawmakers should raise it. I'm not sure whether Ilhan has or not. She's normally very good. But I would urge them strongly to raise this issue because it has nothing whatsoever to do with espionage and everything to do with truth-telling.
Yes, well, they got to figure that out. Maybe you can write Cornel West, who we had on a couple of weeks ago, who is kind of a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, to get him to bring that up because it is very dangerous. Getting back to Corbyn, so you have that development, and then I found it peculiar that the Queen and Buckingham put out a statement saying that they didn't want to get involved in this political affair. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, it was good that this was said, and it obviously is being used by defense lawyers in the trial, that it is a political trial taking place, which should automatically exclude the extradition. But there are other laws which the prosecution is finding very close laws agreed to by previous British governments and the United States, which contradict that. So, I think everyone is following the case, and I think if they decide to extradite Julian, which I strongly hope they won't, the British justice, so-called, will be tarnished yet again.
Yeah.
They've not got a good record in the past, and they basically have done the bidding of the intelligence agencies once again, which they should have learned from in the trials that took place during the Irish Troubles and subsequently with the arrest without trial of large numbers of Muslims in this country. So, we were hoping that the Assange trial would mark a break with that past, but till now, the attitude of the judge indicates the opposite. I mean, what you've got to understand that there is an informal list which is available to the ministries and ministers of law and justice and attorneys and attorney generals, which gives names of safe judges in these trials. Right. And so if there's a trial the government thinks is particularly important, they are given to safe judges.
I see.
We know this because in private they boast about it. But so whether that has happened in this case and on what level, we don't know. I mean, we will see. I think the final judgment will be made by the Supreme Court, at least we hope so. And
Well, that will take
That will
years,
be-
though. That would be years. He'd be tied up in that prison for 2 or 3 years.
I know. No, the big demand should be, like in the case of Chelsea Manning, that Julian should be released from Belmarsh, freed from prison, and let out. I mean, if necessary, they can have restrictions because he broke bail. That's what they come up with.
It's just amazing.
But that's
Amazing.
fine. He can, stay in a safe place, but he must be released from this monstrous prison. And I mean, I thought it was incredibly moving that this is a high security prison for serial killers, mass murderers, terrorists, real or imagined. And these people read the newspapers and listen to the radio. And these prisoners sent a letter to the governor saying that they were opposed to Julian Assange being kept in solitary confinement, and he must be allowed to mingle. And that did have an effect. The governor lifted the solitary confinement, and so Julian could talk to other prisoners.
Yes. Well, they only show, the British legal system show any sympathy is for people like General Pinochet, who was in a beautiful mansion as he awaited an extradition that didn't happen. All right, so listen, I want to talk about the other book for a minute. So we're going to play this Shostakovich string quartet, just about a minute of it, and come back and talk about the dilemmas of Lenin. Okay, can you stay with us?
Yeah.
Okay. That is Dmitri Shostakovich, and that is his 15th string quartet. What'd you think of that? You're a big fan of Shostakovich?
I am, and I think that. I like all his music by and large. Obviously, some is better than others, as is the case with most artists in whatever field. The string quartets are my favorite, and the Borodin quartets, playing of them is particularly good, I think. And I used to listen to them non-stop, especially when I was writing books. Often when I'm writing non-fiction, I listen to music, less so in fiction. But in non-fiction, I always have music playing in my ears or on the loudspeaker.
Right.
And the Shostakovich has helped me along on many a book, including The Dilemmas of Lenin. So that's I'm glad you played that. I mean, a very brilliant composer. And those quartets, actually, if you look at them and read how and when they were written, are very moving. I mean, a number of them were written during the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. It's often difficult for people in the West, especially the new generations, to understand what that war meant to Soviet people all over the Soviet Union and the impact it had on artists on non-artists, on human beings, and some of Shostakovich's string quartets were written in that period, so they are incredibly powerful and moving. I don't have them in front of me, so I can't discuss each in turn.
Well,
so I'm really glad you played that, Randy.
Speaking of the siege of Leningrad, the 900-day siege of Leningrad, I think after 150 days, the Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony debuted there, just to say, "Hey, screw you, Fritz," to the Germans. Am I right that that was debuted in Leningrad?
Yes. And I like it. It's not, in my opinion, as powerful as the string quartets. I think the quartets are very, very strong. In my opinion, it's the best piece of music that Shostakovich wrote. And in some of this music, he is playing homage to Beethoven and Bach, German composers, emphasizing that the campaign wasn't just against Germans, it was against German fascists, German Nazis. Because there's a very moving episode in one of the characters in Solzhenitsyn's book, Rubin, whose real name I now forget, but who wrote a book called No Jail for Truth, in which he describes how, as a German, he was a philologist, and as a German scholar attached to the Red Army and fighting in the Red Army against German fascism, he went to translate Soviet generals addressing the prisoners after the defeat suffered by the Germans in Stalingrad. And he describes in his book that seeing the German officers sitting there with their head in their hands and just saying, "We're sorry, we feel ashamed of being Germans." And then this guy, Kopolev, that's his name, Lev Kopolev, stands up as a German expert and Russian and German language scholar, and tells them you shouldn't feel ashamed for being Germans, because your culture, your language, your country has given us Goethe and Heine and Marx and Beethoven and Bach, and goes through the list of German cultural achievements. And listening to him, some of these people were crying. And that is something which no Western country could have done, where people like Kopolev wouldn't have been let near anything,
right,
leave alone German prisoners of war.
Right.
So I think it's worth recalling that, and this was very important, especially in early Soviet culture.
Shostakovich's family underwent a lot of problems and some persecution during the purges.
Randy, who didn't in the worst dark period of the Soviet Union's history, the height of Stalinism and its purges? Everyone suffered, everyone. I mean, those who didn't suffer had to explain why they haven't suffered. And someone once asked Boris Pasternak, how come all the other great poets were in prison? In fact, Mandelstam, one of the great Soviet poets, said, the one thing you have to say about Stalin's Russia is that they really appreciate poetry. Otherwise, why would have they locked all of us up? They understand. And Pasternak was asked, how come you were never arrested? And Pasternak told this story that during the pre-revolutionary days, he had reviewed in a famous Moscow literary magazine some Georgian poetry published in a Georgian magazine in translation into Russian. And Pasternak, as a literary critic, had reviewed unknown poet Joseph Jugashvili's poem which he thought showed promise. And Djugashvili was, of course, Stalin. And Stalin had this weird thing of never forgetting praise when he was not in power. So Pasternak was never put on the, endangered list in the Soviet Union. He was never imprisoned.
That's a great story. The name of the book is The Dilemmas of Lenin. You can get it at Verso Books. Just go online, get it at Verso Books. You can get the paperback for like $10. It's really the first book I've recommended in the last year, and I've read it twice. It really is this panoramic retrospective of what preceded the ultimate revolution in 1917. But I got to ask you a question. When you wrote this book, a book on Lenin, and it was at the centennial of the revolution, you must have known that it was a targeted, limited audience. I mean, you put a swastika on the cover of a book and it automatically sells, but you put a red flag on it, forget about it. What prompted you to write this book on Lenin?
I felt that the centenary of the revolution wasn't being observed in Putin's Russia at all. Neither the February 1917 nor the October 17 revolutions. They were not part of our calendar, Putin told an Indian journalist. So I felt that there should be some recognition. So Verso decided to publish a couple of books on it, and my colleague China Mieville, a very fine novelist, wrote a history, very wonderful history of the revolution. And I wrote this book centering on Lenin because Lenin, you feel was not just had been made mummified. His ideas mummified, his body mummified. No one knew what he actually said. And so I wrote the book, as I say in the introduction, as an act of resistance to the dominant culture, saying, you're not going to celebrate, you're not going to mark the centenary, except to say it was all a load of rubbish. Well, screw you. Yeah. And so that's why I wrote the Lenin. And, I hadn't read his own writings for a long time, and it was a real joy to do so. And then you discover things which in the 60s and 70s you'd either ignored or you hadn't realized their full importance, like one of Lenin's last writings for the Soviet daily Pravda. He apologized to the people of Russia as he looked around him and all the mistakes that had been made and the civil war and how they hadn't known fully what they were going to do if they'd come to power. And Lenin said, I apologize to the Soviet people for many of the things that we've done. And that struck a real chord with me, because very few leaders of revolutions or counter-revolutions or bourgeois democracies ever say that.
Right.
And obviously he was feeling this very strongly, and his last texts were very brilliant. Many of them, seeing the problems that existed and how they could be remedied. I mean, and so it's worth stressing all this again, and worth stressing also that none of the Bolshevik leadership believed in 1917 that they could have the revolution in Russia alone and that would be fine. They were all banking on the German Revolution. And Lenin wrote time and time again, if there is no revolution in Germany, we might be sunk. And Stalin believed it as well at that time. There's no doubt about that. It's in his writings. Trotsky certainly did. That they couldn't exist for too long unless it spread. Well, it did spread in an unforeseen way, but not in the advanced countries of the capitalist world, but elsewhere, China, Vietnam, Cuba,
Yugoslavia,
etc. And then through military occupation liberations after the Second World War in Eastern Europe. I mean, just one footnote on that, Randy, is that most of the people who fought with the Nazis in Eastern Europe, their ideological descendants are now in power in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Not just the Ukraine, but in lots of countries. They almost come close to preferring, in some cases do, the Nazi occupation rather than the Reds. So it's a very strange world we live in. And for all these reasons, I felt like writing it. And I was also writing it for an audience which knew little. Because of the times in which they were growing up. And one of the things that gave me great pleasure was when I traveled around the country introducing the book, not just here, but elsewhere in the world. Large numbers of young people were present. Many were studying the Russian Revolution in their sixth forms or at universities, but there was just a sprinkling of young people who came out of curiosity, not because they wanted to repeat the process, but they had no idea what this revolution was. So, like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution had now become a part of history. And so I felt a book was necessary. And what gave me special pleasure was that it was translated into Arabic. It's been translated into other European languages, not Russian or Chinese, alas, but one lives in hope.
It's an amazing book. I like in the beginning, you go back and you talk about these early peasant uprisings by Pugachev and Razin, is that his name? But they didn't win. And in fact, I think Kropotkin says it. You have a big piece from Kropotkin's History of the French Revolution, which is the only book on the French Revolution I've never read. I mean, I sat through for weeks trying to finish Thomas Carlyle's History of the French Revolution, but this is the one. And you say the influence that French Revolution had on Kropotkin and then also had on Lenin. Lenin looked up to Robespierre, and he looked up to the Glorious Revolution under Oliver Cromwell. Not that he agreed with them politically, but tactically he agreed with them. Am I right there?
Yeah, I mean, the Russian Revolution was the first revolution to be made by a leadership which knew what it wanted. They wanted a socialist revolution, and that is what they tried to achieve. All the other revolutions had something accidental about them. Mass movements which grew into revolutions. I mean, the Civil War in Britain determined the course of the English Revolution, because prior to the Civil War, and discussions with the monarch, Charles I, during the Civil War, Cromwell and the moderate section of the revolution felt they could do a deal with the king. He could be made a constitutional monarch, etc., etc. And there was a huge debate, and it was Charles refusing to consider any serious negotiation with the revolutionaries, and constantly intriguing, including with foreign powers, to move in and crush the revolution, that forced Cromwell and his colleagues to make the fateful decision, very important in terms of the English Revolution, of putting Charles I on trial and executing him, which marked a new phase in this revolution, as did the execution of Louis and Marie Antoinette in the French Revolution, right, the Jacobin phase. In Russia, there was a civil war going on, and the decision to execute the royal family was made at the height of the civil war by a secret meeting of the Politburo, because they felt that if they did not do this, the white counter-revolutionaries, backed by 22 foreign powers who were intervening in Russia, would use the monarch as the titular figurehead and leader of the counter-revolution, which, they would have done. And that is the reason they gave. So there was no time to hold a trial of the Tsar, which is what Trotsky wanted, and many others too, saying, let's put him on trial and for history, going through the crimes of the system. That never happened, so they worried that the whites might take over the town where the Tsar and his family were kept. They carried out the executions in a cellar, and that's settled that one.
Well, that's the reason why they got rid of Louis XVI, in 1793. Because first of all, he tried to escape, and there were wars going on. The Battle of Valmy, where Danton, you mentioned Danton a lot in this book, and his influence over Lenin. Danton was like a bigger than life figure. He was a great speaker. He was energetic. What exact influence did he have on Lenin?
Who are you talking about?
Danton, George Danton, the French revolutionary, Danton.
Ah, Danton, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, well, the big influence, the big influence Danton had on Lenin and all the Bolsheviks as well as Mensheviks was, he was a fiery orator, spoke for the people, spoke to the people, and muttered the immortal words when asked about the reasons for the success of the revolution. Danton replied, audacity, and yet more audacity.
Right.
And of course, this was straight out of Lenin's own playbook. When almost a majority of the Bolshevik Central Committee was opposed to a revolution at that time, Lenin recalled Danton's words, and he did it. Basically, it was an audacious enterprise, which could have failed, but by the time they implemented the plan, the Soviet state was the Tsarist state was collapsing on every level, so that even the remnants of the Tsar, the constitutional Democrats, just basically couldn't do anything. The army, the breakup of the Tsarist army on the battlefields of the First World War was a decisive event, and Bolshevik agitators on the front made sure that their words were heard. And Lenin's ability to coin slogans which reflected the needs of a very broad layer of the masses, of which the most classic was, what are the demands of the Bolsheviks? Land, bread, peace.
Yes.
I.e., big land reform, food for everyone, and an end to the war.
Right.
So ending the war was a very popular demand, which completely freaked out the Entente powers, but it was very popular in Russia and elsewhere. Lenin's decision to unilaterally end Russian participation in the First World War. So, of course, counterfactual arguments which are often used is that people ask, sometimes I've been asked this at meetings, had there been no First World War, would there have been a Russian Revolution? And to which the answer is, not in that form and not in that shape, but possibly 25 years later or 20 years later in a very different way. We don't know. We can only speculate. But from the point of view of the European rulers who waged that war in a struggle to amass more and more loot and property abroad in colonies, they paid the price for it, actually.
We only have a few minutes left. This book is so good. It's called The Dilemmas of Lenin.
Well, I'm really pleased you like it, Randy. Yeah.
I want people to get just a couple of anecdotes in here. First of all, Bertrand Russell met with Lenin when he was in exile in London and had nothing but great things to say about him, saying he was not an egomaniac. He wasn't doing this for self-praise. He was just moving straight ahead, and he had a job to do. And without him, there would not have been a revolution. I mean, you make that case quite clear in this book.
Yeah. Well, I do say that, and it's an awkward argument because the discussion of the role of individuals in history has long been a contentious issue in discourse on the left. But I think there's sometimes one can say that there would have been a French Revolution regardless of anything else. There would have been an English Revolution had Cromwell decided to leave the country and settle down in New England in the United States, which he was, by the way, seriously considering doing because of the political situation in Britain. They were very depressed, and lots of politicos were fleeing to settle in New England. There still would have been a revolution. I think in the case of the Russian Revolution, you would have had a February Revolution, possibly, but even that was difficult without the First World War. But without Lenin, even with the First World War, there would not have been a socialist revolution. Of that, I'm convinced.
Well, what I've read, I agree with you, and you make a very strong case here. Just one other meeting between Kropotkin, when he was like 75 years old, and Lenin, I think in 1922. They had a very good discussion. Can you recap that discussion between the two and how it came apart?
Lenin had a soft spot for the anarchists. And he didn't agree with anarchism, but he was not in favor of prosecutions. And so when Kropotkin left his exile in London and moved back to Russia after the October Revolution, the government the state provided him with an apartment and other financial help, and then a meeting was set up between Kropotkin and Lenin, and many things were discussed. And Lenin said to him, Kropotkin complained about the encroaching bureaucracy, and Lenin said, as you know, this is an old problem in this country, but we would be very happy if you kept us informed of any display of bureaucracy and bureaucratic insolence. Just let me know. And then Lenin came to the point, which was the point of the meeting, which was Kropotkin's history of the Russian Revolution that had influenced a whole, not just one, but 3 or 4 generations. And Lenin, it was out of print. And Lenin said, we need your permission to put your book back into print. And Kropotkin said, yes, but you know what our views on the state are. It can't be printed by the state publishing house. To which Lenin smiled and replied, no, we will make sure it's published by a cooperative publishing house. But do we have your agreement? And old Kropotkin said, in that case, you can publish it.
That's a great story to end with. The name of the book, once again, is The Dilemmas of Lenin. And in the very beginning, first half of this interview with Tariq Ali, it's In Defense of Assange, and it is available at orbooks.com. And it's a terrific book, and it's educational, and people should get it out there because more people need to know about the real situation that Julian Assange has undergone over the last decade. And, of course, this book on Lenin, Dilemmas of Lenin, Verso Books. It's been a real pleasure. I have so many pages, and it's been a delight this week. I saw videos, I read articles by you, and it's been a great week of prepping for this. But I'm leaving 9 pages of notes on the floor because we don't have enough time. And once again, thank you very much, Tariq. We're going to play something from the Gadfly here, and so stay on the line for 1 minute so I can say goodbye, and we'll play this for you. This is by Shostakovich as well. Okay, that was Tariq Ali, and that was Shostakovich, and that's been a long show. I don't know if we're cutting it into two or what. I don't know. This is Randy Credico. You've been listening to Assange Countdown to Freedom, live on the fly with Covert Action Magazine, covertactionmagazine.com, and at AssangeCountdownToFreedom.com. Support this show. We plan to do this until everything is resolved. We will continue. I want to thank my good friend, Anonymous Scandinavia, my good friends there, for making these videos, or turning the videos into soundtracks. They have been, and all of the promotion that they've done for this program over the years. Thank you, folks at Anonymous Scandinavia. I want to thank Frank, the engineer, who did another brilliant job today. And who else do I have? nycpodcasting.com. I want to thank Margaret Ratner-Kunstler for giving me this book to read and to help me get Tariq Ali. Tariq was great. I want to thank Alicia Castro and Marty Stoller. We'll be back next week, folks.